All right, let's jump right into this. The year is 1807. The map of Europe is being violently redrawn, and we are looking at one of the most thrilling geopolitical dilemmas and devastating military climaxes of the era, the bombardment of Copenhagen. This is a story all about survival, the total illusion of neutrality, and the terrifying lengths nations will go to when they feel their backs are absolutely against the wall. We are diving straight into the height of the Napoleonic Wars today for this explainer, unpacking a moment where the rules of engagement were literally rewritten in fire.
So I want you to ask yourself a pretty profound question. Is it ever justified to attack a completely neutral country? It's a heavy thought, right? But it sits at the absolute center of today's historical narrative. To understand exactly how the British government answered this question over 2 centuries ago, we first have to really immerse ourselves in the intense, almost suffocating pressures that both sides of this conflict were facing.
To really grasp this, picture the core tension of the era. On one side, you have an isolated Great Britain, totally desperate to survive. On the other side, you have a neutral Denmark-Norway making a massive amount of money trading with everyone. Denmark was using its armed neutrality to profit heavily from the chaos in Europe without actually antagonizing any major powers. But for Britain, access to the Baltic Sea wasn't just about trade. It was literally a matter of life or death. The Baltic provided timber, pitch, and hemp. These materials were the lifeblood of the Royal Navy, basically the oil of the 19th century military machine. Britain's survival depended entirely on keeping that route open, which made the neutral Danish fleet a deeply terrifying wildcard if it ever fell into Napoleon's hands.
And the clock was ticking. The pressure in London had been building relentlessly. By 1805, Napoleon was decisively crushing the Russians and Austrians at Austerlitz. The very next year, the Prussians were completely humiliated at Jena. Then came the absolute turning point, the Treaties of Tilsit in July 1807. This monumental agreement essentially sealed Napoleon's dominance over the entire European mainland. Suddenly, the only gaps left in his continental blockade were Portugal, Sweden, and Denmark. This new geographic reality created a profound sense of claustrophobia in London. The neutral Danish fleet, a highly capable naval force that was temporarily mothballed, suddenly morphed into this massive, dangerous puzzle for an increasingly paranoid British leadership.
Driven by intelligence reports and swirling rumors of a secret maritime league forming against them, one supposedly involving Russia, Denmark, and Portugal, the British government felt this unprecedented pressure to act immediately. You can actually hear the sheer panic gripping London at the time in the words of British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Spencer Perceval. He forcefully argued that it would be sheer madness and completely idiotic to wait for an overt act of war. They genuinely believed Napoleon was just days away from forcing Denmark's hand. In the eyes of the British cabinet, waiting around for undeniable proof of a Danish-French alliance was the exact equivalent of committing national suicide.
So, what do? The result was an ultimatum of just sheer audacity. British diplomat Francis Jackson was dispatched to present Denmark with strict, non-negotiable demands, handing them an impossible choice. He essentially framed a hostile demand for their entire fleet as an unavoidable act of British self-defense. The Danes were bluntly told, "Hand over your navy to us for safekeeping, and we promise we'll return it when the global war finally ends. Refuse, and, well, we'll simply take it by force." The Danes, largely oblivious to the actual imminent danger and desperately clinging to the very navy that guaranteed their neutrality, completely rejected the demand.
And honestly, the resulting military confrontation was a staggering mismatch from the very start. The British expedition, commanded by General Lord Cathcart on land and Admiral James Gambier at sea, showed up with an overwhelming force, around 25,000 battle-hardened troops and 126 ships. Facing this juggernaut was a severely underprepared Danish defense. They had maybe 5,000 regular troops, some poorly equipped militia, and a fleet sitting totally inactive in the harbor. The tragic irony here? The Crown Prince of Denmark had actually marched the vast majority of his real, battle-ready army to the southern border to deter a potential French invasion, completely leaving his capital's back door wide open to the British.
Things escalated incredibly fast. British forces rapidly sealed off the island of Zealand, and by mid-August, they were landing troops on the beaches almost completely unopposed. While the Danes bravely tried to mount a defense, their local militia was simply no match for professional British regulars. On August 29th, a British force led by Arthur Wellesley, who, by the way, would soon gain legendary fame as the Duke of Wellington, completely routed the Danish militia reserves at the Battle of Kogi. The engagement was so lopsided and the Danish militia fled in such a sudden panic that they left their heavy wooden footwear scattered all across the fields. Because of that, the conflict was cheekily dubbed the Battle of the Clogs.
But here's the catch. Despite sweeping the countryside, Taking a heavily fortified capital city like Copenhagen with infantry alone is traditionally a grinding, slow process, and the British were completely out of time. General Cathcart was acutely aware that the fast-approaching winter weather would soon freeze the Baltic Sea, which could trap and destroy his wooden naval fleet. Driven by this ticking clock, Cathcart made a brutal, highly controversial tactical decision. Rather than attempting a prolonged siege, he opted to bypass the city's main defenses and target the civilian population directly. He prioritized the safety of his ships from the winter ice over the lives of innocent civilians. It's a stark, chilling example of total war.
To execute this rapid assault, the British introduced a terrifying new piece of technology to the European battlefield. Enter the Congreve rocket. Developed by William Congreve, whose designs actually traced all the way back to the 13th century ideas of Roger Bacon, this was purely a terror weapon. They couldn't be aimed with any real precision, their flight paths were wildly erratic, but they made this shrieking, unearthly noise as they flew, and they rained literal, unquenchable fire down onto Copenhagen. Against a tightly packed medieval city built largely of wood, these firebombings left the population utterly defenseless.
Over just 3 relentless nights between September 2nd and September 5th, British artillery units fired roughly 300 of these incendiary Congreve rockets directly over the city walls. They arched through the dead of night right alongside traditional heavy mortar fire, creating a truly apocalyptic scene for the trapped citizens. The night sky was lit up with constant flashes of destruction, and the consecutive explosions were so severe that the ground beneath Copenhagen literally shook for days.
Tragically, this ruthless bombardment resulted in approximately 195 civilian deaths and 768 injuries. Now, you might hear that specific death toll and think it sounds surprisingly low for a 3-day, continuous bombardment of a major capital. But that actually reveals the calculated logic behind the attack. The British weren't necessarily trying to maximize casualties. They were engaged in a strategy of mass property destruction. Many civilians had successfully evacuated beforehand, but that meant there were very few able-bodied people left to fight the massive, spreading fires. The British were essentially holding the city's entire infrastructure hostage by simply letting it burn.
And the resulting destruction was absolute. Over 1,000 buildings burned entirely to the ground, with 38 major fires raging simultaneously across the capital. In a massive psychological blow to the Danish people, the tallest spire in the city, belonging to the beloved Church of Our Lady, was struck and came crashing down in fiery ruin. What's worse, the British utilized a uniquely cruel tactic. They deliberately aimed their heavy artillery directly at the largest fires. Why? To kill the few remaining firefighters and hamper any organized efforts to extinguish the flames. Finally, on September 7th, unable to watch his city burn for another hour, the Danish commander, General Peymann, surrendered entirely to save what was left of his people.
And just like that, it was over. The British achieved their tactical objective with absolute cold efficiency. By the explicit terms of the capitulation, they took immediate possession of the entire Danish fleet and all associated naval stores. True to their strict timeline to avoid the Baltic winter ice, the British forces were packed up and sailing back to England within just 6 weeks. They came, they bombed a neutral capital, they took the ships, and they were gone, leaving the Danes standing in the smoldering ruins of their city with zero compensation and absolutely no further promises.
The sheer scale of the loot the Royal Navy sailed away with was just staggering. Over a quarter of the prize consisted of massive, highly valuable ships of the line, 18 of them to be exact. They also took 11 frigates, 9 brigs, and 26 gunboats. But they didn't just take the floating ships, they completely stripped the naval yards of all raw materials, hemp and timber, and intentionally destroyed the dry docks. They effectively set Danish maritime power back an entire generation, firmly securing British naval dominance in the Baltic for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars.
But what happens when the smoke finally clears? The immediate aftermath sparked a fierce, deeply polarizing moral and political debate back in Britain. Defenders of the bombardment, heavily supported by newspapers like The Times, framed the extreme aggression as a grim military necessity. They spun it to the public as a bare act of self-preservation. They had to justify this unprecedented strike to a British public that still highly valued the concept of fair play, arguing that stopping Napoleon from choking off British trade and threatening their shores justified bending the rules of international warfare.
But not everyone was buying it. In fact, a massive faction within Britain was absolutely horrified by the civilian cost and the blatant violation of international neutrality. The opposition in Parliament was so outraged they nearly brought down the entire government over the decision. Even the British monarch, King George III, was deeply unsettled. He's historically recorded as condemning the preemptive violence, calling it a very immoral act. This preemptive strike fundamentally fractured British society.
Many prominent figures argued that the nation's character and honor had been deeply, perhaps permanently, stained by raining fire upon a neutral capital. So we also have to recognize the complex, unintended geopolitical legacy of the attack. Yes, Britain solved their immediate, terrifying problem. The Danish fleet would never serve Napoleon's empire. But the long-term fallout was incredibly severe. By ruthlessly bombarding Copenhagen, Britain effectively pushed a previously neutral Denmark directly into an official, highly motivated alliance with France. This sparked what became known as the Gunboat War. The deep irony here is that by trying to prevent Denmark from becoming an enemy, Britain essentially created a hostile fleet of nimble Danish privateers that constantly harassed and bled British shipping in the region for 7 long, grueling years.
Which brings us full circle for the end of this explainer. I'll leave you with this final, provocative thought to ponder. Was the tactical victory of securing a fleet actually worth the strategic and moral cost of destroying a neutral city? When we look back at the 1807 bombardment of Copenhagen, we're really looking at a historical mirror. In our modern age, where preemptive strikes and the urgent demands of national security are still hotly debated on the global stage, how do we measure the true, lasting cost of striking first? It's a fundamental question of survival versus ethics that historians and modern strategists still grapple with today. Thanks for joining me, and keep questioning the history that continues to shape our world.